Hello, I'm Dana Sparks, broker with Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with terminating an agreement on due diligence prior to the obligation for the buyer to remit the earnest money. So let's say you write a contract, and in the contract the buyer and seller agree that buyer is to remit earnest money X number of days after binding agreement date, and then of course the holder to deposit after receiving the earnest money. But the buyer terminates the agreement under the due diligence contingency prior to that time frame within which the buyer was to have remitted the earnest money. You as the agent, you have to terminate the agreement, and you also have to address the earnest money even though it has not yet been remitted. So you have to do a TNR, what we like to refer to as a TNR. Now in the GAR contract forms, both of these provisions, the termination and the agreement to disperse the earnest money, is on one document, on one form. In the RE contract forms, these two separate provisions to the contract are on two separate documents. One is to terminate the agreement and the other is to address the earnest money. So regardless of which contract package you are using, the earnest money still must be addressed. So even though it has not been remitted by the buyer, and the buyer and the seller have agreed to this in the binding agreement, if earnest money is addressed in the creation of a contract, earnest money must also be addressed in the termination of a contract. And license law dictates that the parties must agree in writing regarding the disbursement of earnest money upon termination. And that writing must be agreed to in a separate instrument, separate from the contract that instructed what happens to the earnest money, i.e. a termination and release agreement. So what you would do if it had terminated upon contingency, i.e. a due diligence period, right to terminate period, then all you do as the agent is you terminate and you put the reason for termination, and then under the part where you're addressing the disbursement of earnest money, so all you put is buyer to retain earnest money not yet remitted per terms of contract. That's all you do. But you do have to address what happens to the earnest money. If you put that in a termination release and you send it to the co-op agent, and the other party, for example, it's going to be the seller in this case because the buyer is terminating, if the seller does not sign that, you need to let the holder of the earnest money know, and they still need to write some sort of letter to the parties basically indicating the same thing, that buyer to retain earnest money not yet remitted per allowed for contingency in the contract, because the buyer is terminating on an allowed for contingency. But the holder is still charged with responsible for that earnest money in the contract. So that's why if you do not get the agreement on the release portion of the earnest money from the seller, please let the holder of the earnest money know, and it has to be dealt with and addressed by the holder of the earnest money. So all you would do is upload that document into your transaction and paperless pipeline, put a note in there stating that the seller will not sign the release money, and then the broker we will send a letter to the parties indicating the same thing. So thank you so much. Again, I'm Dana Sparks, broker with Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.